How are you doing?
Yeah, I'm all right, thank you. How are you?
I'm decent. You're sounding tired or exasperated.
I am tired. I am tired and sore. I did Tough Mudder at the weekend, as
Of
as
course.
you know. Thank you for the little
Yeah.
congratulations message.
Oh, that's
Appreciate
all
that.
good.
But yeah, safe to say it's taken its toll on myself and the team. Myself less so than some of the others. I don't bruise very easily. Whereas some of my teammates have got some pretty horrific purple splodges all over their
Oof.
body. Whereas I'm just kind of old man. I feel like an old man. You know, like when an old man stands up out of their chair and they go, ooh, ooh, and everything's
Yeah,
just stiff and creaky.
not gonna lie,
That's me right now.
I'm prone to doing that without doing a Tough Mudder first. So, you're doing pretty well
Yeah.
if that's all you're getting.
I had a bit of a funky knee yesterday, but that's gone entirely. Because we did Tough Mudder on the Saturday, and then we went home and showered and like cleansed, and then went out for a nice little kind of meal, which we did after the first one we did. So last year we did the 5K, and then this year we stepped it up and did the 15K. And each time we then go for a little meal at a local pub, just as kind of a way to kind of round off the day and swap stories and like have a debrief basically, because I think otherwise it'd be very easy to just go home and go to bed and just like collapse. So having a little like round off to the end of the day feels like a nice little, I want to call it a tradition, but we've only done it twice, so I think a tradition has to happen at least 3 times and then has to keep happening. But it will become tradition if we keep doing them.
Yeah,
which
tradition in the making.
I could fully intend and see us doing. Yeah, tradition in the making. But when we were at the pub, like the bathroom was upstairs, so every time someone had to go to the toilet, it was funny just watching them come back down the stairs again, just really, really gingerly and like awkwardly. And obviously we're all like dressed like fairly nicely. We were in like a fairly nice pub, and everyone else was just out on a regular Saturday night, just getting pissed, and then we were just like hobbling around. And then on the Sunday we just popped down to Filey, which is one of the beaches up north, just to get some like sea air and stretch out the limbs a little bit, treat ourselves to some fish and chips and some ice cream, some high calorie goods to make up for the fact that we'd just done 15K and 31 obstacles. And I think that's really kind of helped the recovery, because if I'd have just stayed at home and stayed in bed, I would have definitely just completely stiffened up. Whereas going to the beach and going for a little walk along the beach, hit the spot, a little bit of sea breeze. But yeah, a very full weekend, but a very fulfilling weekend as well.
Yeah, it sounds it. I mean, I was going to say that the pub afterwards almost sounds braver than the Tough Mudder itself. That's real commitment to not just flopping in bed, which I both admire and am mildly confused by. I would definitely just want to crash at the end of something like that. I don't think I've ever even ran 10K, let alone 15K, and let alone with lots of obstacles and whatnot.
The thing about the 15K is it's much more like intervals rather than like running a full 15K. Because every time you come to an obstacle, there's obviously like a couple hundred people on the course. So, sometimes there's a bit of a queue, or sometimes it's just an obstacle that takes a while to kind of overcome. So it's not a continuous 15K run. It's more like,
I mean,
500 to a kilometer, and then you hit an obstacle. And the running, if anything, is good because it means you can warm up after going through freezing cold water or whatever. It definitely takes some amount of stamina.
I understand your first point there about if you have to queue, but when you said some of them take a while to do, I don't accept that as a valid description of a break at all. Doing another task.
For example, while you're like
doing another task, a physical
but you're
task
not running
in the middle of running. No, you're just doing something that's arguably more knackering.
But it's knackering to a different part. So like if you're doing monkey bars, that's like upper body knackering, whereas your legs are just dangling there, so you're giving your legs a rest.
Yeah, but
So it's all
when
good.
I'm running, it's not necessarily it's the breathing, isn't it? You get to a point
Mm,
where it feels like you're not taking in oxygen, and there's a general overall sense of knackeredness. It's not just your legs
yeah.
getting tired. It's just being completely spent after a while, I guess. I don't know. I'm impressed.
Thank you. I think it's very, I mean, I was about to say, I think it's very easy to end up kind of talking it down because, like, when you're doing it and you're in the moment, you're feeling very determined, you're feeling very motivated, and you are enjoying it. I think I like to think that most people are enjoying it. I was enjoying it. Like, overcoming challenges that kind of scare you a little bit or do physically push you. So when you're in the moment, you are like running and you're like, oh, this is kind of like, beginning to burn or whatever. But you're not as focused on it as you would be just on a run. Because when you're just on a run, all you can really think about is the fact that you're
Mm.
running. Whereas when you're doing like the obstacle course, you're thinking about, oh, I can't believe I just did that last obstacle. Oh, I wonder what the next one is and how am I going to approach it and that kind of thing. Like, I don't know, you just feel very set on your goal, and you're with a team as well. You're with a team of
Sure,
people.
yeah, and you're getting constant it's almost like what you're describing there is constant dopamine rewards, essentially. Lots of small little tasks. It's like a little
Oh,
metaphor
yeah.
for how to work productively. I
Yeah.
feel like if I was so inclined, maybe I'll do this on my spin-off podcast, which is
Mm.
I've
This
my
week's.
new one I've decided is going to be a motivational talk
Wow.
podcast. And I'm gonna talk about your experience doing the Tough Mudder. Um, I'm going to live that vicariously through you and use that as a metaphor for motivated working. So join me on that.
I did have the ultimate rush. I think probably the biggest kind of endorphin, dopamine, whichever one you want to pick, rush was from like my personal highlight of the day was one of the obstacles was called Funky Monkey. And I'll send you a picture of an example of it. There won't be a picture of the exact one because every course is like slightly different. But the general gist is
Mm.
if you imagine like have you seen like Ninja Warrior?
I actually have never watched it, but I know the concept. I guess what was that one with the big red balls? Uh,
Yeah.
Total Wipeout. I've
Total
seen
Wipeout.
that.
I
I've
don't
seen that.
think there's anything in Total Wipeout similar to it. But Funky Monkey is essentially you've got these monkey bars that like go up on a gradient on an angle. So it's over like a body of water as well. So it's got these monkey bars, and there's like maybe like I don't know, 30 or so bars to get across. And then once you've got to that like the top of that bit, which is the highest point, that's kind of in the middle, in the center. And then the next thing you need to grab onto is like a rotating wheel. And then the thing after that is like a rotating swing wheel. And then there's another smaller swing wheel. And then you're at the end. And we got there and we saw quite a few people doing it. Very like ripped, you know, fit looking individuals. And then lots of other people were just there like, oh, I'm just gonna, take a dip. And a couple of my teammates grabbed onto the first one or the second one and slipped in or fell in. And then one of my teammates who has got very good upper body strength managed to smash it out. And that was just really, really cool to see. And I was just there like, I'm just going to give it a go and get as far as I can and see where it goes. But I wasn't expecting to get far at all. I was thinking like maybe like, third or fourth rung, and then I'll probably end up slipping
Mm.
off. And as I went, I just got further and further and further until I was at the top. And then I was like, well, I'm here. I might as well grab onto the really like insecure looking swinging wheel. And then I grabbed onto that. And then I was like, well, I've done that. No point letting go now. Might as well grab onto the next thing, which was like the swinging loop. It's quite hard to describe without a visual image. I will send you one. But grabbed onto that, swung round. By that point, practically at the end, grab that thing, next thing, come down, and then before I know it, I'm at the other side, and I've just done the whole thing, and I was just like, "What the fuck?" Completely taken by surprise and just absolutely pumped. And my teammates were
Amazing.
just like, "That was absolutely mental." Like no one expected me to do it, and I don't know. That was just like the absolute highlight. Honestly, I think that was like the most pumped I've ever like felt. I was just like so like pleased with myself. That like all the like upper body training and grip strength training had paid off, and then it
Oh
very
yeah,
satisfying to then turn around and see like really muscular dudes failing and slipping off and all that kind of stuff, and you're
yeah.
just there like, yeah, I smashed that.
That is incredible.
And I think that's the what's so good about Tough Mudder is it really like brings out these moments of you impress yourself,
Mm,
and if you put the work in and the training in, you do have these just fantastic moments where you look at something and you go, I can't do that, or I'm scared to do that. And then through your own determination or your team's motivation, you smash it. And then you can turn around and look at it and go, holy fuck, I just did that. I just conquered that fear, or I got over that physical obstacle. It's just such a high.
it's really lovely. It's really lovely that the Tough Mudder is such a team activity as well. Because I suppose these extreme sports kind of stuff. I don't know whether you can call this extreme sports. It seems extreme, but I guess there's not the death risk of other extreme sports. But often anything like that, where you're sort of pushing the human body to its limit, it feels like quite a rugged individualist kind of thing.
Mm,
So there's something really sweet about it being so team driven, and the importance, as you're saying, of that
yeah.
team support.
Well, there are a lot of obstacles that are like massive walls, essentially. So you need help from other people.
Yeah,
You
yeah.
can't. Some people who are like prime physical fitness can do it solo, but a lot of it is you need people at the top and at the bottom to give you a boost or to give you a pull.
Mm-hmm.
So like everyone you're running with, like all the hundreds of people on the course are also your teammates. Like you're all in it together. And that's what they drill into you at the start when they're sending you a wave out. They like do a whole like Tough Mudder pledge.
Mm-hmm.
And it's like, oh, this isn't a race. This is a, we're all in it together. It's not timed. It's about getting yourself to the finish line, but it's also almost more importantly is getting everyone else to the finish line. If you see someone struggling, you help them. If you get to the top of something, you like help the next couple of people up, and then someone should take your place kind of thing. And a lot of the obstacles are based around groups working together. There's like a lot of obstacles that an individual couldn't do by themselves. They need other people in place, and that's what makes it so good. Yeah, that's part of what's cracking about it. I could probably rave about it forever. I could probably be a Tough Mudder salesperson now at this point. This section is not sponsored by Tough Mudder,
Cult
sadly.
leader.
Yeah, little Tough Mudder cult leader. But how have you been?
Yeah, it's definitely not sponsored by them. Now that I've called it a cult, I think that's gonna ruin any sponsorship chances. Sorry, you can edit that one out. I retract that. It's not. It's not.
It's a little bit of a cult.
A healthy cult.
Mm,
It's a healthy, lovable cult,
yeah.
and you just have to use our discount code, and you can sign up too.
Can we get
We're
sued
not
for
sponsored.
pretending to have a discount code? Is that like dodgy? Feels dodgy.
Possibly. I feel like there's plenty we've done that in theory, I'm sure we could get sued for. I can't remember exactly what we said about McDonald's last time, but I'm sure some of that was.
Yeah, that's already been lost. But yeah, how have you been?
I'm good. I've not got anything quite as interesting to report. I think this could actually be the first recording we're doing where one of us hasn't been away, which is nice to sort of not sound like complete and utter jet setters.
Yeah, it just kind of coincidentally landed that our recordings were like over the time of year that most British people travel. It's not that we're just like regularly jetting off.
It was funny that they're just a different location each week. Wild. I've been good, but yeah, nothing that interesting to report that I can think of. It's been a sort of melancholy weekend, I'd say. Hannah has moved out of her flat, so that feels like an end of an era. When I was kind of going through my unemployed phase, I sort of spent a lot of time there looking for jobs,
Yeah.
and then I moved down to London and continued to spend a lot of time there.
Got a lot of memories in it.
So yeah, exactly. That was sad, and I also feel like because I did help out a little bit, playing my new role as the strong man. I was kind of lifting things, etc.
Yeah.
But I think ultimately because I was doing less, I could just sit and feel melancholic about it more than Hannah or Anna had a chance to. They were just so busy
Yeah. They just had a
hiding
job
and
to
then
do.
and then cleaning. Yeah, exactly. They were so
Yeah.
caught up in it. It was stressful more than anything else.
Mm.
Whereas I was just feeling very sort of uh, not yet nostalgic about that, I suppose. And then my flatmate Lucia also moved out the same weekend, so
Oh, the
it
double
was a weekend
whammy.
of change. Very
Yeah.
much a feeling of an era coming to an end,
Mm.
but
But
the
a
start of a
new
new
era
one.
starting as well.
Yeah,
Yeah.
exactly. So that's the position you find me in now,
Mm.
at the beginning of this new era, whatever that is or means.
It'd be interesting if I think it's always interesting how much like where you are in your life and what's going on around you impacts how you perceive listening to music for the first time when you hear it, and where that then
Mm.
sits with you going forward is that every time you then listen to that song or artist or album, it doesn't necessarily entirely take you straight back, but it will always kind of make you reminisce of the era. So I do wonder if that kind of little melancholy weekend, if you were listening to the album all over that melancholy weekend, if that has affected your perception of
That
Helplessness
was
Blues.
That was such a smooth segue, Louis. I don't even know where you're going to put the jingle. That's the dilemma. That's the dilemma I'm feeling there. We can
We'll
we can
put the
cue.
jingle in here.
Yeah,
Interrupt the
cue the
smooth
jingle.
segue for a really jarring jingle right here.
Cue it.
More of something else entirely.
Okay. Now I can answer that. But yes, I was thinking exactly that because I on the Saturday I just put on my moping playlist, which is what are you thinking about? And it's full of all of these sort of vaguely acoustic-y, sort of downbeat, miserable men and women, I suppose.
Yep.
And then I'd been playing all of that, and then I started playing the Fleet Foxes album for the first time, and I just thought this is actually very fitting with the general tone of this weekend
Mm.
in that regard. It's sort of that wistful, staring out the car window kind of music. Do a brief introduction to the album before we get so smooth that we're right into the depth of the discussion.
Yeah, I'll do a little mini. Well, I think yeah, we've got like a bit of a rhythm with doing a bit of an introduction, don't we? Just a few little highlighting facts. So this week's album is Helplessness Blues by Fleet Foxes, a band who every time I say their name, my mouth just wants to say Fleetwood, and I have to stop myself and say Fleet Foxes. This was their second release after their initial debut, which was their self-titled album, and it was released on May 3rd, 2011. It's indie folk, pretty much to a T, and I thought I'd just thrown a interesting little tidbit about the band. At this time, their drummer and backing vocalist was Josh Tillman, who you may know because he left the band in 2012 to pursue his solo career under the name Father John Misty, who some of you may know and some of you may not. But yeah, there's my little Helplessness Blues introduction. And my personal introduction to it is that I don't really remember the first time I came across it or listened to it or how I found it or where I found it. But I'm going to start with a very strong statement and say, in my opinion, this is a perfect album.
Wow, right in there. I I'd be interested. My first question then, not to make it too interview like, but my first question straight from that is, even if you're not sure exactly when you first found it, is there a time in your life when you were listening to this? Because a little part of me was, this doesn't seem un-Louis, but we were talking about something that sort of takes you slightly off guard. This could be the first
Yes.
one in a way. I think this probably isn't exactly what I'd have expected from you necessarily. And I'm wondering, is it something that was it your younger self? Has it been a more recent thing? Where did this come along in your life?
I think it's more recent. I think that the reason I can't pinpoint the exact time I found it is because it is more recent. I don't associate it with like a childhood memory or anything like that, which I think more often than not, when you find something when you're younger, you can almost exactly remember where you first heard it or who first showed you it. I have a feeling I just found it when I think it was in 2020, the dark times. And I was doing a bit of a music deep dive and trying to find, new songs to listen to. And I was trying to gain appreciation for listening to albums and just having a dig through various recommendations, various album lists, all that kind of good stuff. And what it really just takes me back to is, I think, it must have been in 2020 during one of the various lockdowns, but like one of the summer ones, and just being sat in my parents' garden with the sun out, everything very green, everything very like warm and nice, but also kind of with this shroud of uncertainty and, just that little glimpse of misery that we were all experiencing at the time. And just finding this album and finding it very comforting. And probably because of, what the weather was like when I was listening to it, finding it very kind of summery and like just it's for me it feels like a very wholesome album, and it just tickles my emotions right in the the right spot to just give me the kind of the warm and fuzzies, and feels a little bit hopeful, and that I think that probably does come from, like I was saying earlier, about like when you listen to an album or a song, the context of your mood, I think, lingers with it pretty much forever afterwards.
Yeah, I think you're so right about that slightly hopeful vibe as well. It's just the right parts, anthemic and intimate. It does a bit of both of that in the way that a lot of that, the best of that sort of indie folk or sort of folk rock, which really sort of the other thing that struck me is that was such a thing, wasn't it? There was a whole era of that, which a bit like the kind of mid-noughties indie scene also produced a lot of trash, but some of the kind of core influencing parts of that scene, like this, I presume, were just banging and really sort of struck a chord. It also makes
always managed to shine through.
Yeah, exactly, and it also makes so much sense to me now. You saying that it was the sort of summer of, or one of the lockdown summers, because I know you said last time that it was a summery album, but I was listening to it thinking it almost feels more autumnal to me because there's this kind of air of melancholy, and talking about the way that emotions can influence an album, maybe that could have just been my sort of aforementioned emotional state. But I think that sort of air of melancholy gave me an autumnal vibe, but seasons were just different and weird. Everything was different and weird in lockdown. So that actually that's so fitting. It's this kind of lockdown summer that comes with an air of introspection and reflection.
I can definitely see the autumnal vibes though. I think like for me it is a weirdly warm, summery yellow grass album, but it simultaneously is a kind of wet and brown autumnal album, and I'm not sure how it straddles both, but it does in my interpretation of it. And I think a lot of that comes from just how warm and rustic and lush the instrumentation and the production is. It's very I don't know why that springs to mind, but it feels like the kind of album that you could imagine playing, right? Picture the scene. You've been at a wedding, and it's been a wonderful wedding in like a redone barn or something like that. It's not been a traditional one in a church. It's been in a barn, and everyone's sat around like a bonfire at the end of the night. Everyone's had a bit to drink. Everyone's feeling merry. You're all like wearing waistcoats, and the flames are like flickering in the reflection of the wine glasses. And this album is on in the background. That's kind of an image and a vibe that kind of springs to mind whenever I listen to it.
I can very much see that. Maybe it's like you know how September comes along and you're so ready for autumn by that point, but then actually it's almost like a summer spillover a lot of the time, and it's this really weird month Maybe it's like that. It's like that kind of an album almost, sort of embodies those vibes. I also think what I was just going to say before, the words you were using, things like rustic, uh, for whatever reason, give me a kind of, like the whole sort of synesthesia thing. I feel like everybody kind of gets various versions of it, and there are certain words that just have a certain color associated with them. Rustic feels, maybe just because it's got the word rust in it, actually, that would make complete sense. Rustic feels orangey. It feels that sort of warm orange to me. And that fits with both.
It's a warm orange
It
album.
fits both with the dry grass vibe and the autumn leaves vibe. So on that kind of purely visual sort of representation of the sounds, both of those fit, I suppose.
I'm glad that you mentioned earlier as well that you found it to be quite an anthemic album, because this is definitely one that I find myself, if I'm listening to it in the car, for example, turning up very loud and singing along to, but also making sure that the volume's loud enough that the actual talented vocalist drowns out my terrible attempts. But I do enjoy, there are several lines throughout that I do enjoy belting along to that I feel are particularly poignant. And also some that are just fun to sing, like Sim Salabim on Your Tongue. Just every single time that line comes around on that track, I don't know, it hits the spot.
Well, I'd be interested, perfect opportunity to move on to another question. I'd be interested to know whether this is for you a lyrics album. I mean, I wouldn't ever expect you to say that something's purely a lyrics album or a music album for you, or sort of rather a melody album or whatever, or purely a rhythm album, whatever the various sort of subcategories might be. But is your first thought of this lyrics, or I mean, is that too reductive as well? Do feel free to say if that's too reductive, but how important are the lyrics to you?
I think it's a very poetically written album, and like in the sense that everything is very much kind of weaving a narrative in a very kind of storyteller way, and with a lot of comparisons and metaphors and similes, and I think that's all very beautiful, but it does in its own way make it a little bit harder to follow the lyrics necessarily. I think for me, something that's like true for most of the music I enjoy, but I think particularly this album, is it's less about what the lyrics are necessarily trying, like the story that they're necessarily trying to tell, or what the artist has in mind for each track. And it's more the kind of the feeling and the emotion and the energy and the vibe, like in combination, and like what that conveys and what it makes me feel. And I think that's something that I think the best thing about this album is the rich instrumentation. I think the lyricism is lovely, but it's kind of a cog in a greater machine, to reference the album's own lyrics. But I think the instrumentation is what really carries this album for me and makes it just such a bombastic and lively and at points melancholy album. I think I think it's an interesting one because I think it is definitely a melancholic album, but for me it also covers such a wide spectrum of emotions. I think there are moments of like triumphant joy. There are like scenes of determination. There are quieter moments of pause. There's I don't know, it generates feelings of all sorts of like, commitment, distress, hope, romance. It's a very romantic album, I think. It's in the sense that it conveys a lot of the emotions, the highs and the lows of romance.
Yeah, if a romantic album feels like an apt description for it, to be honest. And I think that's a feeling I get from a lot of anything that's got folk tinges. It's almost a core part of folk as a genre, insofar as you can call it a genre, I suppose. Is that it's pure expression, isn't it? I suppose it's supposed to be.
Something that I love about it as well is, to just play off the fact you say it's pure expression, is I think a lot of folk music falls into the trap of being romantically inclined, but being quite careful with it, quite quiet with it, and quite maybe not necessarily somber, but definitely slow and soft. There's a lot of slow and soft folk music. And for me, I think the folk music that is the best, and something that Helplessness Blues falls underneath, is when it is full of expression and they convey the emotion and the romanticism through not just steady, slow melodies, but through like swelling grooves and cohesive sound. And there's some, very kind of almost triumphant moments in the backing tracks of this album, as well as like
Definitely,
quieter
yeah.
moments. Like, I think a really good example of that is The Shrine, an argument, where the argument is kind of portrayed in the music. It's very bombastic and there's big clashes, and you can feel tension and you can feel like this eruption of emotion between the two characters who are mentioned in the story. They're not like acted out. It's very much from one perspective, but you can feel the emotion of both sides in the latter half of an argument, and then how there's that kind of clash, and then they drift apart and they go their separate ways, and then there's that kind of reflection on and the confused emotion, and there's that kind of messy bit at the end, messy instrumentation at the end, that I think is supposed to represent that kind of confused and angry and bitter emotion that kind of is left as a residue after a big argument like that.
Which is an incredible moment. It's one of my favourite moments on the album. It's one of the ones I've got written down here. Interestingly, the first time before I'd even clocked, because obviously it's in the name of the song, let alone in the sort of lyrics, but before I'd clocked that, I'd written down, which part of me still stands by, but it makes no sense in the wider context, so I can't stand by it too strongly. But it sort of reminded me of like a force of nature effect, and I wrote down it reminded me of like a gaggle of geese when you hear some geese flying overhead.
Yeah, I see that.
Which then reminded me of, because there's a sort of classical piece by this Finnish composer who I tried to look up, but I'm not even gonna try to pronounce the name. It's a long, complicated one, very, very Scandinavian. But he's got this piece called Cantus Arcticus, which uses the sound essentially like a dawn chorus, I suppose, sort of tundra birds in the composition. And that is just from a pure musical standpoint, it actually kind of reminded me of that. And there's a very ominous swell to the tune to begin with, and then it sort of begins to resolve into something a little bit more beautiful. And just from a musical standpoint, there was something kind of similar there in this piece. And the link there as well is that this is a kind of neo-romantic kind of composer, so it's romanticism that these guys are sort of doing in the sort of full breadth of the term, I suppose. It's which is kind of what you were getting at as well. It's not just a sort of limited what would be the word, like romanticism, as in it's not about love all the time, or although this is about an argument, I suppose, but it's not just a certain set of emotions put through a certain set formula. It's full range of expressions.
It's not just your soppy first few days of puppy love. It's the complicated nature of intense emotion.
Exactly that, yeah. And it's got moments, I guess, like you said, with the word triumphant, it's got moments of awe and sort of wonder and just everything. And yeah, I do love that. I love unashamed kind of romanticism, I suppose, is what I'm trying to say.
I thought, well, I did when I was just doing a quick lookup of, the little Wikipedia summary for the album. And then I thought I'd try and gather a little bit, see what other people have said. And I'm sure you're very aware of the Needle Drop, Anthony Fantano. But I quite liked a little thing he'd written about it, saying, the album is unbelievably in love with everything around it. And I think that's a really beautiful way to kind of summarize how it feels. And then I think for me, that also then translates to the listening experience, because when I listen to this album, I feel like I see the world around me through a new lens of like wholesome joy and beauty. Like everything seems more vibrant and lush when this album is playing, which is why it would be my go-to on like a summer day in the garden or like a summer evening or an autumnal day if I want to kind of be present in the moment. And it feels very fitting to kind of have on if you're in a place of natural beauty. It kind of captures that sense of awe almost of your surroundings and comfort as well. I think in particular the back end of the titular track Helplessness Blues, just talking about if I had an orchard, and it just feels like it would be the perfect track to have playing while you were in an orchard at sunset, and like dusk is the crickets are chirping away in the background, and you just have that sense of rustic, earthy wholesomeness and purpose almost.
This actually brings us quite close to something that I wanted to explore, but I feel like I don't quite have the language to, so bear with me if this comes out slightly muddled. But do you get this vibe from certain folk tunes, and especially when they go into that sort of lush instrumentation? I suppose I wrote it down as instrumental crescendos is how I wrote it, which happened quite a lot throughout the album.
Oh, I like that.
I was trying to work out what creates this effect, but I think maybe it's related to what you're saying about that sense of nature. I think it sounds very psychedelic. I think the only other thing that I was thinking that it could be is just because of our sense of what psychedelic is obviously a cultural one, which is something we've touched upon sort of throughout this podcast. We talked about the way that culture influences your perception of music. So I didn't know whether it's just that there was obviously a whole wave of psychedelic folk that was probably using some of these traditional folk melodies and sounds. And I don't know whether that's just meant that now when you hear more straight up / folk rock, it's reminiscent of that, or whether there is something more about that it is like this kind of trance-inducing and sort of slightly in a nice way, slightly hippy-dippy, sort of tree-hugging, sandal-wearing, yogurt-weaving kind of effect, essentially.
Yeah.
And so that's my scattered thoughts on it. I was trying to work out what that phenomenon is, because I'd never really noticed it before, and I sort of noticed it on this, because I wouldn't necessarily describe this as a psychedelic album, which is what made me think, oh, maybe it is just that these kind of folk melodies have been used by so many psychedelic. But I think you're sort of talking about its links to nature make me think, actually, yeah, maybe there is something more to it than that. It has a sort of transcendental quality, I suppose, would be a very short way of saying what I was trying to get at.
I really like that perspective. I hadn't really thought of it in that way before, and I know that when you find critics of Fleet Foxes, and by critics I mean angry people on the internet, they do tend to say, "Oh, these are fucking bearded hippies making beardy hippie folky music." And I think whenever you get some beardy hippies in a room together, the likelihood of it becoming a bit psychedelic increases with each beardy hippie in the room. So I think that's definitely an aspect
Maybe
of
that's
it. And
it.
I think
Maybe there's a link there.
But I think it definitely, as an album, I think it definitely I think it transports you. It's simultaneously one of those albums where you can listen to it while feeling a bit melancholy, looking out the window of a train or public transport or a bus or whatever, and be very present in that moment. But also you could close your eyes and be transported to the world, the orchard, or the various locations described in the album. Yeah, it is beautiful, and I think there is so much beautiful imagery in this album. I think weirdly, I very rarely have this kind of thing where music makes me think of another form of art, but I don't know if you know, there's a very famous painting. If you don't know off the top of the head, it might be worth you Googling it, and just to have it in front of you. It's called The Wanderer Above the Sea of Fog.
It sounds familiar. Oh, comes up straight away. Oh yeah, which is a classic of romantic
a classic
paintings.
romantic painting that captures the awe and wonder of nature and like harks
Yeah.
back to like the original meaning of the word awesome, which is like and awesome and awful, meaning so full of awe that it's like overwhelming, which was typically used to describe nature. And Helplessness Blues, and maybe it is like the psychedelic elements of it, but it definitely creates the same sense of awe and wonder that kind of painting and that kind of era of paintings inspires in me. I'm sure it's different for other people, but I get the same feelings listening to the album as I do looking at that painting.
No, that makes complete sense to me, and it's so interesting that sort of having with me having come to it without much information, and you having sort of come to it and been with it for longer, we've both had that similar sort of emotional reaction to it, I suppose. That seems like a sort of genuine thread to it, I suppose. And when we were talking about sort of romanticism, I was very much thinking of that kind of like sort of 19th century romantics. There was the whole movement of people who were sort of going to the Lake District. So Wordsworth is kind of your classic one, Coleridge as well, John Ruskin, and they were all obsessed with the beauty of nature and beauty in everything, and a certain aesthetic attitude to life in general. And that just feels linked. I think the main thing is that all of this just feels like it links to. I feel like you're putting into words better, basically, this sense I was getting from this kind of lush instrumentation. I even made a note actually saying that they're my favorite parts of the album. Those moments when it would go into a kind of, what I described before as an instrumental crescendo.
There's swelling moments, and when they combine with an expressive line. I was trying to think earlier what it was off the top of my head, but I was also trying to think what to say next. But when we were talking about particular lyrics, when I have them on in the car, and it gets to a certain point where I definitely want to like sing along, the one that gets me every single time is from the Helplessness Blues song. When it gets to the point where it says, "What good is it to sing Helplessness Blues? Why should I wait for anyone else?" And that bit is kind of a triumphant, loud, outspoken moment on the album lyrically, and it lines up perfectly with like what you were saying, a little bit of a bombastic swell in the instrumentation. I feel like I keep using bombastic, but I can't think of a better way. An awesome swell, if I'm going to go back to using some old-timey romantic language.
Yeah, it's funny you mentioned that lyric as well, actually, because I don't have the exact lyric written down, but one of the ones that I made a note to call back to essentially is from just before in that song, and you've already made a reference to it, but the bit talking about sort of growing up in sort of idealistic wonder, I suppose, at the uniqueness of everything, the uniqueness of me, my sort of individual freedom and all of my potentiality and everything that I can do in this life.
Raised
and
to
world.
believe that you were a snowflake distinct among snowflakes.
Exactly that. And then as you get older, sort of that sort of being beaten out of you, and not just that you stop believing that, but you stop wanting to believe that. It suddenly becomes also overwhelming, and you'd much rather just sort of become a speck of nothing, a cog in the machine. I just thought that was a wonderful and succinct kind of rumination on growing up and all of the complexities of that.
I find it quite beautiful as well that it's not just to be a cog in a machine, it's to be a functioning cog in some great machinery serving something beyond me. And I quite like the idea that you lose that kind of luster to be distinct and unique and outstanding, and you'd rather kind of settle into this kind of safe place, but you still want to be kind of reliable and be working towards something, and
That's so true. Yeah.
be part of something that as a whole, maybe you as an individual aren't this special little snowflake, but what you're working towards on a whole could be something special and worthwhile. And I think that can apply to so many things, whether it's like a certain job that is rewarding, even down to just working towards, building a family and building a home. And you're just doing what's needed and what's necessary to provide for more than you. And I like that kind of image of selflessness. And I think that's what, with the album being written so poetically, even though it is, clearly like various ups and downs throughout a romantic relationship, there's a lot more to individual lyrics and individual songs where you can take other messages out of them. And that kind of harkens back to what I was saying about it's not necessarily about what the lyrics were intended to mean. It's more about the kind of how you read and perceive them and the energy that you kind of take away from them.
And that's something we touched upon, I think, way back in the first one, sort of talking about that moment of expression in a lyric combined with the melody, sort of, and with everything that comes around it, the way that can make you feel. And I'm glad that you think like that as well. Not that there's any right way to think about it, but it's a bit like with cinema. I think sometimes with cinema, the most powerful thing, I suppose, at its core, at its most simple, it's the marrying of image and sound, isn't it? I suppose, and that in particular, though, even more simply, in fact, it's actually probably just that sort of image and the sort of power of that. Similarly with music, it's just that sound, at its core, it's just sound, and the way that sound can make you feel. Basically, what I'm trying to get at is I don't necessarily always like to overly reduce something to say the meaning of it, or at least not if it's any one confined meaning. I think that can feel overly reductive to what makes it so powerful. I mean, if you wanted to do that, I think there's like a Baldwin quote, James Baldwin, where he says something like about Uncle Tom's Cabin, which at the time wasn't like the racist novel we see it as today. It was actually like a kind of sort of a civil rights novel. It was trying to sort of say, actually, these people deserve more rights. Slavery is a bad thing. It just did so in a very condescending tone. But James Baldwin has a sort of article on it where he says it's not that it's racist. I mean, or at least that's not. I'm trying to think how to phrase this. It's the worst thing about it is that it's ultimately a very bad novel, basically, is what he says. If you want to, it's a good pamphlet because it worked. It made people suddenly sympathize and sort of and want to change the laws. It's an awful novel because it did so by being entirely reductive and offering no complexity or nuance. That sort of general comment applies to a lot of art. I mean, there's a lot of things that you can do where you could make a very good pamphlet with some of the kind of content that people get from these things. I.e., somebody could look at a sort of piece of art and they say, oh yeah, the point that it was trying to make was really good. But if it's all about just this one point that somebody's got from the film, not the way that point was made or anything, just the point that it made. I mean, you could make a pamphlet to do that. That when looking at art, you need to look at the way that it makes that point, and also the sort of multiplicity of points that art can make, the nuance it can engender. That was a bit waffly, but there's a point in there somewhere.
Yeah, no, I totally know what you mean. Yeah, I like that. Do you have any other thoughts that you want to share about the album? Your like experience coming to it fresh faced? Because I'll admit, I've listened to this album easily 20 times all the way through by this point. So a lot of my opinions have been formed by multiple listens, and I can't remember what my opinions were from the first listen, other than clearly I want to listen to it more. So I'm just curious if you have anything a fresh face to it.
I think we've touched upon a lot of the things I had in mind. I think one of them that I touched upon briefly was, I don't really have a point to make about this particularly, but just that I was struck by how there was a whole era where there was a lot of stuff that sounded like this. There was a lot of, probably a little bit later than this, I'd say it was like sort of early to mid 2010s, I suppose, probably following on from this, kind of like that Mumford and Sons era, I suppose.
Yeah.
And there was some stuff that I listened to at the time that was kind of like that, but I don't think quite on the level of this. Like Bear's Den, if you've ever listened to them, I'm
yeah.
not slagging off Bear's Den here,
I know the
but
ones.
I kind of feel like, well, it's been a long time since I've listened to them actually, so I could be being unfair here, but I kind of feel like this is better.
This is
Bear's
better.
Den were.
Yeah, no shade, but
Okay.
this is head and shoulders above Bear's Den and Mumford and Sons, and I'm confident in saying that.
Good. Okay, I'm glad I have you to back me there. So, if anybody's a huge Bear's Den or Mumford and Sons fan, you can throw that eye
Fuck
at
right off.
Louis. No, I'm not saying that. You see, only Louis saying that. So direct any of that anger.
The thing is, I
please.
came in very strong by saying to me, this is a perfect album. This is a 10 out of 10 album. Every song is wonderful, and there's no weak points, and there's no filler, and everything. It does everything that I want an indie folk album to do. So obviously, when it comes to me comparing, I'd say this is easily Fleet Fox's best album, and I think it's probably the best indie folk album. It's definitely the best indie folk album I've ever heard, and I've heard all of Mumford & Sons albums and a good chunk of various other artists in the genre, including Bear's Den. So there, fight me.
I feel like that's pretty.
Or don't fight me. Listen to the album and have a lovely time.
I would say as well, it's not quite indie folk, I wouldn't say, but I'd say it's got some folk tinges. I'd recommend, if I'm allowed to just give a spin-off recommendation,
Of course.
Frightened Rabbit, who I've mentioned previously. Frightened Rabbit's album Midnight Organ Fight is just an incredible album, and even if we do cover it at some point on this, I won't cover it soon because it feels too related. But I was obsessed with for quite a long time, and that is my album of just pure emotion, like unabashed emotion album. A bit more on the kind of straight up romantic level as well, in that it's pretty much a breakup album. But the guy just wore his emotions on his sleeve, and the music is absolutely gorgeous and beautiful. And I always thought that it had a sort of tangential link to a lot of that scene, that sort of indie folk scene, even though I wouldn't quite describe it as that. But that album in particular has some songs that are, I suppose. I never liked the idea that they could be compared to Mumford & Sons at the time, I have to say. For some reason, I've always had something against Mumford & Sons in particular. Sorry, Mumford.
I'd say...
I'm your son.
I don't want to throw too much shade, but an idea that just popped into my head, a comparison, is that Mumford & Sons is to folk music what Michael McIntyre is to comedy.
You know what?
Make of that what you will.
I'm going to say that feels accurate, because there are plenty of ways in which you can defend Michael McIntyre as popularizing the whole genre of entertainment, etc., 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 but also
very
there's
safe.
plenty
It's
of
a
other
safe pair
arguments
of
to be
hands.
made. That he's very grating and annoying.
Yeah. So it's a comparison that's up to your interpretation. I have one last thing really to say, unless you have anything else that you want to touch on.
No, hit me up. I'm ready.
My last thought, just kind of on the production side of this album, I've always thought it felt very much like it was almost like a live performance. It feels like you're seeing them or hearing them in a very intimate venue almost, especially if you've got like a nice listening setup, if you've got some nice headphones on or some good speakers or whatever. But even when you like blasting it in the car, my car does not have a particularly good sound system, but it does feel very raw and intimate and live. And that's another thing I kind of love about it. And I found out that that was kind of almost done on purpose, where they decided that they wanted to record this album in like each song was just one take, and if there was like any misplays in the instrumentation, or if he didn't hit the correct notes on the take, it was all just included, just to make it feel kind of more authentic and in the moment and real. And I think that was a really good decision. I think you do run a risk of overproducing certain genres of music. I think certain genres work really well. Like last podcast's album, Chinatown Slalom's album, Who Wants to Be a Millionaire, benefited hugely from very clean, crisp production values. Whereas I think when you've got such an emotional and romantic album, like a lot of indie folk aims to be, I think you want it to sound a little bit rawer and real, and you want to be able to almost visualize the fingers plucking on the strings of the instrument and can kind of create that kind of church hall ambiance in a way with the recordings. And yeah, I just wanted to kind of bring that up and highlight that that's another facet of this album that I enjoy.
No, that really adds like another layer of richness, I feel, to understand that about the album, and it makes complete sense thinking back on it.
What are your favorite tracks from the album, if you had to pick just a couple?
Oh bugger! I didn't actually write down favorite tracks. I really should have done. I can write down tracks that clearly I sort of noticed key things about. Simsalar Bim. I love the last 2/3 of. I think that was the first one that struck me with that sense of how beautiful the instrumentals could be. So I'm going to say that. I'm going to say that's one of them. I think I'd probably have to say Shrine / An Argument for that sort of free jazz, atonal, abrasive brass bit at the end. I just thought it was a welcome bit of just variation on one level, but also abrasiveness and sort of risk taking for the album, and it sort of pays off, and it was just nice to hear. It's just totally unexpected, and I'm a sucker for being struck by something totally unexpected.
Yeah.
So I'd say that. I've got Bedouin Dress written down just for that little violin riff, I suppose you'd call it. I love that slightly off-kilter violin. I'm sure that's something that would change with more listens, to be honest. I think I'd need more listens to pick out favourite tracks. I've only had 2 listens through. Maybe Helplessness Blues as well, actually. Okay, that's 4, but that'll do.
As has been the case with both my picks of album, I find it very, very difficult to pick favorites. So with this one, I'll just say again, a 10 out of 10 flawless album. I love every single song to bits. If I had to pick 3 favorites, it would be The Shrine / An Argument, Lorelei, and I think Helplessness Blues is one of my favorite songs of all time. I just adore that song from the very beginning to the very end, all 5 minutes and 3 seconds of it. It just absolutely hits the spot for me. And in the context of the album, I love that it's followed up by the Cascades, which is just a short little instrumental that kind of winds down from Helplessness Blues. I think that's thing to mention is that the flow of the album works beautifully as well. Each song just flows so lovingly into the next one. But yeah, they're my top 3, and Helplessness Blues is maybe one of the best songs ever written, in my opinion. Big bold claims this episode.
Big claims, very big. We're not averse to them though. We have made some claims, including slagging off some of the top rappers in the world, I feel. Or actually, we were just talking about Mac Miller doing that. I can't remember how much we actually.
I think we also slagged off Drake because he deserves it.
Yeah, that's
thrown into the dig there. But as you know, as with all music, it's all personal opinion. So if you disagree with me, you're wrong, and I feel sorry for you. But I respect you for having a different opinion. Yeah. Speaking of different opinions, I don't know if you remembered during our Mac Miller recording, I mentioned looking up some negative reviews of the albums as and when they're available to see what angry people on the internet have said. I found some interesting ones. one that touches very much on something I mentioned earlier. But I will quickly mention, I do see a lot of people who love this album but don't think it's as good as their debut. Those people are wrong, but it is a fairly I can see it being a valid thing, like line of thinking, but it's because I think this album is very much more, in my opinion, it's more of the same but an improvement in every regard. Whereas I think there will be certain people who miss certain aspects of, like, I think the first album's a little bit simpler and a little bit hosier almost, a little bit more close to that kind of safe indie folk, whereas, as we've been saying, this one's a little bit more expressive. That said, so this lovely individual gave this album 1 out of 5 stars, and they reviewed this back in 2011, so shortly after it released. The first album for me was a grower, and I was really impressed both times I've seen this band live. This album, however, stinks. It's a self-indulgent, boring morose. The lyrics are really quite poor, and the song's irritating, unsatisfying, and this is the bit that I don't understand. They say the songs are forgettable. Hopefully just a difficult second album that seems they have seriously lost their way.
I like that they acknowledge that
God.
the first album was a grower for them, and then have proceeded not to give this one a chance to grow on them.
Yeah,
amazing.
they reviewed it 5 days after it released, and we're like, yeah, nah, fuck this album.
That's brilliant.
This is garbage.
Well, yeah, credit to them for being open-minded. That's
It just doesn't even remotely strike me as any of these songs being forgettable. I could understand if, like, the instrumentation can be quite busy at times. So I could see if you're listening through like a tinny speaker or whatever they were listening through in 2011, being a little bit overwhelmed for their poor ears. But, like, forgettable and unsatisfying, I don't know. I can't see that. I don't know if you can see that being newer to the album, but less biased than I clearly am.
I don't really get it on 2 levels. I mean, 1, I don't think it is forgettable, but 2, I'm immediately suspicious of that being somebody's critique of an album. Because, I mean, if you're just looking at some of the greatest works in classical music or sort of jazz music or kind of pop music more broadly, most of them, or very many of them, won't be memorable if your aim is to just have a catchy tune to be able to recite on the first 1 or 2 listens. I mean, that's just not necessarily what you expect to get. I mean, it can happen, don't get me wrong. I mean, even in classical music, I mean, there's famous, like, Mozart riffs. The classic da 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 da. Is that Mozart? Da 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 da.
Isn't that Beethoven?
Oh, that might be Beethoven, but you know,
I don't know. It could be Bach. Who knows?
I know nothing about classical music, but point is, obviously, there were almost like pop riffs of their day, but a lot of them, it's not like people were going there just humming the tune on their way home. That's not what music is all about, and I'm suspicious of not to take this comment too seriously. It sounds like I'm getting very wound up by it now, but yeah, I don't think that's necessarily the most productive way to go about listening to music, I suppose.
There's another review by someone who goes by the name Mr. Joe, and this was also reviewed very, very close to the initial release date. Which is surprising me. I didn't really think about Amazon being used for reviews back in 2011. But this kind of touches on what we were talking about, what happens when you have a couple of hippie dudes in a room, because this review titled Veggie Burger, which is already creating an interesting
promising
vibe. Fleet Foxes are 6 scruffy dudes in desperate need of a shave. They are into that whole hobo shtick, I imagine, just to convey how it's just about the music. People tend to have 0 personality and 0 sex appeal. I assume they are posh kids. 1 star.
He threw the curveball in at the end there. Oh, my guy Joe just waiting
It
for the sex
reads like a
appeal.
meme review, but I don't know if meme reviews existed until he needs his hippie indie folk boys to have lots of sex appeal.
It's yeah. Who would be the go-to sex appeal? I guess he's got a problem with the whole genre because of the lack of sex appeal. I guess that's the issue. I was trying to think of the go-to sex appeal for indie folk, but it's probably not.
Would it be Mumford or would it be his sons?
Yeah, that's a very good question. I know very little about his sons, so who knows?
Yeah, they're a bit of a mystery. I found another review that was a veritable essay, and a lot of it is just angry rambling. I won't read out the whole thing, it's too long. But it ends with the Fleet Foxes really phoned it in on this one. And I think that's got to be one of the most outrageous statements about, even if you hated this album, I don't think you could pretend that anyone on this album phoned it in. This is not a lazily crafted album. There's no one who sounds like they're half asleep in it for a paycheck, even remotely. And that makes me wonder if, and again, this is someone who was talking about how this tragedy is compounded by the fact that I loved the EPs and the first LP, loved them long time. And yet, for some reason, this album, which is more of the same but better in every way, is phoned in. I just can't put myself in the perspective of that mindset.
It is interesting the number that seem to be previous fans. I've not listened to the first album, so I can't particularly comment, but based on what you say, if it's not even that radically different, normally these people get outraged when there's a big shift, I guess. Or a very noticeable dip in quality, which I can't quite see how people would get from this album, but I suppose we're all restricted to our own perception on music.
Yeah, bear in mind, that's just 3 angry Amazon reviewers, so not representative of most people. This is a really well-reviewed album, unsurprisingly. Lots of 8s out of 10s, 9 out of 10s, you know, high scorers. Roguely, NME gave it 4 out of 10, and I did read that review of it, and I actually couldn't figure out what they were saying. You know how sometimes music reviewers have a tendency to aggressively overwrite because they have nothing to say and they just want to sound clever. It was the most overwritten piece of dross.
Not gonna lie,
I just couldn't grasp. And maybe I'm too dumb.
I don't want to add to the number of people we've slagged off, but music journalism can be an utter sham. Basically, just people like us, but given a lot of status. That's not necessarily a good idea.
Yeah, don't give us any status. It'll only end badly.
I am ready. I am ready to be quizzed out of my mind.
It's time for the quiz. Da-da-da-da-da-dum. That's not.
We've decided that's the jingle only.
I was about to say that's not the jingle, but I guess we have decided that is now the jingle.
No, we definitely have. I fully back every time you just doing a variant of that. I thoroughly enjoyed that last time.
Okay, good. Okay, strap in for questions on fleets and foxes.
I'm ready.
What is the maximum length of an adult fox?
Ooh, maximum length. Was that? Did it not give a range of sizes or anything like that?
The quiz that I stole this from did give a range, but as this is a more of something else entirely quiz, you just have to pluck an answer out of your ass and hope for the best.
Okay. So you're giving the top of that range.
Yeah.
And is it snout to tail? I've got important questions here.
It's snout to the end of their bushy tail.
Okay. I'm gonna say 60 centimeters.
You know what? You're only 30 centimeters shy. It's 90 centimeters, over 3 feet. Not a bad guess though.
God, that's quite long.
Quite good for.
That's like a small human, isn't it?
yeah, I guess. I guess a human
I
could
guess
be 3 foot.
maybe a child.
Yeah.
Yeah. No, that feels very small. Actually, that's yeah. Okay.
You're off. I am gonna start having to like go back through these episodes and start checking our scores. But for the time being, you're currently on 0 of this quiz.
Brilliant. Okay.
Which is the largest fleet in the U.S. Navy?
I don't know what that even means. As in, I don't know. I didn't know that they had. Is this like a region of the US? Each region has a different fleet. Is it for a fleet for a purpose?
So
I'm gonna say it's their Air Force carry, like their plane carriers or something like that. I
I'll
don't know
give you a
whether
little
I'm
more
barking up the
context.
right tree.
For what a fleet is. So a navy is made up of fleets. The same way that, say, like an army is made up of regiments or battalions. So you would have a fleet of ships, and in your fleet you would have some aircraft carriers, some destroyers. It operates as like a battle
Sure.
unit.
Okay. But then, how are those units? Am I literally guessing a number here? Then
You are guessing whatever
like
this
as in
fleet is referred to as.
oh no. Um, the Pacific Fleet. I'm just gonna call it the Pacific Fleet.
I'd say that's not a bad guess. The actual answer is the 7th Fleet.
So it is a number.
Yeah.
Bloody, I wasn't gonna get that anyway.
It turns out that the US Navy have, I think they have 7 fleets in rotation, and they're all just named after like numbered fleets, but it's not 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. It's like 2 through 7, then 9, then 10 or something. Like there's some fleets that are out of rotation. Something like that. I mean, I half-assed
Right.
Googled this earlier, so don't email me and tell me that I'm wrong, because I don't care. And also, no one's listening to
No,
email
I'm
me, so it's okay.
I'm accepting all of this as straight
It's
facts,
fact.
Louis. So
Why were foxes introduced in Australia?
probably to go after another introduced animal. So I'm gonna say to go after introduced rabbits or something.
Spot on.
What? Really?
Spot on. Yeah, they were introduced to regulate the rabbit
Oh,
population.
you know what? I am far more buzzing about that than I ought to be. That's
That's the kind of high
that has
Tough
made
Mudder
my
gives
day.
you.
Yeah. Yeah, take that, Louis, with your funky monkey. I've just got this quiz question right.
Okay, well, Mr. Big Head now. Where is the US Navy 6th Fleet headquartered?
That is a good question. I do not know the answer to it. I'm going to say Portland.
You want me to give you a clue?
Yes.
It's somewhere that me and my mates from home considered going for our lads' holiday this year. That's a clue that does not help you.
Okay. Well, it does. So now I think it's gonna be Europe. It's gonna be like their European fleet or something along those lines. I'm gonna say Cyprus instead.
Much closer. It's based in Naples, Italy.
Oh wow, that's random. The headquarters.
Yep, that's where they're headquartered. And I thought the same thing. I was like,
So
oh, that's
rogue.
rogue. But I guess because it is like a big port city with lots of access to the Med, so kind of makes sense.
God, the US get bloody everywhere.
Final question. What is the average lifespan of a fox?
13 years.
Oh, so close. 14 years.
Oh,
I'll give you
bloody
the
hell,
point
you
for
can
that
give
one.
me
To
that.
be fair,
Yeah. Just getting
considering
it on
it's
the
an average
Fox facts,
lifespan, I'll allow it.
Yeah.
I'll give you that one. That was a good guess, though.
buzzing.
That was a suspiciously good guess. I feel like you've been researching fox
Nah,
facts.
that's. I feel like I could give rough estimations of like certain animals' lifespans. I reckon.
Is
Generally,
that
the
going to be
bigger the
another?
animal, the bigger the lifespan.
Yeah, that's a good rule of thumb. Is that going to be another podcast spin-off? Solo Ronan podcast is just listing
Yeah,
off
that's.
guesses of lifespans.
Yeah, there's not even anybody there to correct me. I'm just doing it for the whole podcast. I'm just there, coming up with a new animal. Oh, otters. They're another one. Oh, yeah, that's probably about 15, and that's it. It's just that for 45 minutes.
I'd listen to that. For maybe the first 10, and then I'd be like, yeah, I get what this is.
Well, that's good because it's really struggling at the moment, guys. So you really need to
Go give it a follow.
show me that support. I think I've either over diluted the market of Ronan podcasts, and it's really starting to become a problem. So if you could help me out a bit, please. I think this is like my 5th podcast, or yeah, somebody should have warned me about this. Don't oversell yourself.
Don't stretch yourself too thin.
Yeah.
Well, that is the quiz. Do you have your album, your next pick?
I do. I think it's been getting difficult, kind of thinking about how to select albums.
It has,
And
yeah.
Yeah. So I mean, actually, I've not really got anything more to say on that. It just has been quite difficult choosing and how to get this sort of variation right. There's all these sorts of different categories. I had decided I wanted to do a classic, so I'm taking us back in time now, which is quite fitting because we've already moved back a bit by going to 2011. This has taken us back to, I think, 1995.
Ooh.
And it's Tricky, Max and Key. So Tricky is the artist, Max and Key is the album. And
See, I would have thought that was the other way around.
Yeah, it's another one that's kind of ambiguous, if I'm honest. But this is a seminal album of the trip hop genre. One of the big original Bristolian 3. You've got Massive Attack, Portishead, and Tricky. And Tricky was, in fact, a member of Massive Attack to begin with.
So that's really cool.
So we're off to Bristol for
Very
some
exciting.
Comboyne harvesters, and actually they don't know you'd be Comboyne harvesters in Bristol, I suppose.
We're off to Bristol for the Yogscast. What else is in Bristol?
Statues celebrating awful figures in history. It's got it all.
It's really got it all. Lovely place. Bro, I'm excited to listen to that, actually. Yeah. Any closing thoughts, feelings, or shall I do the wrap up?
Please support the spin-off podcasts. I've invested all my life savings into these, and they are really not picking up. The one about various murdering first ladies really has not tapped into the true crime market that I thought it would.
It somehow managed to get negative listens.
I know, honestly, I was shocked when I saw that as well. It's I mean, how did that even happen? It's not good. They're my closing remarks.
Brilliant. I'll do the little outro, which is just basically me saying, I should write this down so that I have it, like, I'd have to keep thinking of it off the tone, but thank you very much for listening. If you are listening, you can find us on all your favorite podcasting sites. If you're listening to us on Spotify, but then suddenly decide that you morally object to Spotify, you can hop on over to Apple or wherever else. I'm also uploading these episodes to YouTube as well under the same name, More of Something Else Entirely. Still haven't done any social media stuff because that's just effort for the time being, but maybe one day. But we do have an email, More of Something Else Entirely. If you've listened to this album and you have any thoughts and feelings you'd like to share, or if you agree or strongly disagree with anything that me or Ronan has said, feel free to email in, and maybe one day we'll have some things to read, do like a mailbag or something. Who knows? That'd be nice. But yeah, I think that's everything. So thank you for listening. Thank you for joining me, Ronan. I hope you enjoyed the album, and I hope if you listening go away and give the album a listen as well, I hope you enjoy it as much as I do. Thanks and goodbye.
See ya. Just thought I should throw in that.
Cheeks and eyeglasses and lying policemen. And the capitalists proffer napalm and money in green suitcases to the naked. And the communists create heavy industry. But the heart is also heavy.